Okay, so let's get back now to our review, and we're looking at chapter 15. Please remember that when it comes to certain concepts that involve numbers, whether it's commissions, discount points, other sorts of things, you can get both principle-related questions and math-related questions. So some things can show up in multiple different ways. So within the finance area, some of the basic things like discount points, for example, and origination fees, you need to know what those are in terms of being prepaid interest, being income tax deductible, and we'll go over a math example on Tuesday night where you might also need to calculate that kind of thing, as well. So same thing can be true with commissions. Again, you can get questions that relate to them as a principal point, but also the math that relates to it. So common kinds of scenarios. Regarding loans, fundamental things like who pays for what. The charges, right? The basic idea of, the discount points and the fees and how they work, and that they're paid at the closing, and that if you want to borrow $100,000 but you pay $1,000 in fees, you don't get 100, you only get 99, or you got to roll it into the loan to get the 100. That's a pretty important fundamental stuff to understand, whether you're an investor, an agent, or whatever. Some of the language that's in chapter 15, some of the legal terms like alienation or acceleration, defeasance, all of those are important terms to know. Not only to recognize, oh yeah, this has got to be the right answer's got to be defeasance because I remember that term from that chapter. I could describe a scenario and the right answers, or the options that I give you are alienation, acceleration, defeasance, and something else. And then you got to figure out which is which. So you need to remember what those are and what they do. So alienation is that due on sale clause. Acceleration is the right of the lender to declare the debt due and payable in full when you're in default. Without it, mortgage foreclosure, loan foreclosure would be completely different. And the defeasance being, some people like to think of it as defeating the lender's interest, but that's when the lender has to release their interest because you paid off the loan or something to that effect. I sometimes have questions in here on assignment of rents. I think I talked to you about that during that chapter, that to my way of thinking, an assignment of rents is a fairly common thing in loan documents because no lender who recognizes that all you have to do is move out of your house and rent it to somebody is going to loan you money without an assignment of rents clause, right? Because if you're in default, the worst place for a lender is that you're collecting rent and not making the mortgage payment. So that rent assignments idea is fairly important to understand as being fairly common. Even in owner-occupied housing, the loan docs are going to cover that. And when we're talking about some of those things like alienation, acceleration, and defeasance, understanding kind of how they apply, I think in case of defeasance at least, there's an Illinois example in there about the satisfaction of mortgage documents. So you could get a question about the $200 fine, about the 30 days the lender has to provide the release. Those kinds of things are also fair game, not just the memorization of the term, but also how it would apply in an Illinois-specific scenario. Knowing enough, understanding enough about both the mortgage and the note to really understand what each one does. So I use the term financing documents a lot, or loan docs a lot, because in commercial real estate, it's not an obvious mortgage and an obvious note. There are other documents. There's a lot of contract stuff that goes well beyond that. But for the typical residential deal, right, the mortgage note is the one that creates the security interest. It's the one that gets recorded. It's the one that allows the lender to take away the giant wooden box when you fail to make your payments. The note's the business deal. The note says what the interest rate is, if it's an adjustable rate or a fixed rate, when and where payments are due. Might even have your social security number and other details, and the note does not get recorded. So again, recognizing sort of which clause or which terminology, which principle is going to show up in which document is also important. So things that we just started talking about, like alienation clause and acceleration clause and defeasance, those are all part of the mortgage, for example. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the mortgage foreclosure process and how it would play out, specifically in Illinois. So you should look for a question or two related to that, particularly today, because there are so many distressed sales, not just here, but at the state exam. That really makes a lot of sense that the tests emphasize that more today than they would have when I got licensed, because when I got licensed, it was a very unusual, atypical case. Today, we're still processing a large number of distressed sales, whether it's short sales or foreclosures. So know those rights and those processes as it relates to that. That would include things like deficiency judgments. Again, this is a really critical area, even just of consumer protection law, because the average person who thinks, oh, I can just give my house back to the lender and they'll leave me alone, we should know that that's a dangerously wrong decision, right? Because what's the worst place to be in real estate? Having all of the obligation, but having all of the obligation responsibilities, but none of the benefits. You give up that property, but you don't get the deficiency judgment waived. You don't get that liability waived. You still owe all the money, and you now don't have the benefit of the asset, right? So, I mean, it's important to recognize that in Illinois, lenders can pursue us for the debt unless they specifically waive that. Then there will be some math questions, several of them that relate to finance that we'll go over Tuesday night. And we'll look at those in more detail and expect to see a lot of numbers. So for those of you particularly who are math phobic, please take a deep breath anytime you see a number on a test. Because not every question with a number in it is a math question, right? And there's no value to you to go, oh my God, that's a dollar sign in there, and there's a 1 after it, oh my God. If all we're doing is using that as part of the description of the question, you know, to give you a basic idea that, you know, somebody bought a house for $100,000 and their name was Fred, what was their name? It has nothing to do with the dollar amount that's in there. So again, you know, remember to take a deep breath and look at it, because many questions that have numbers in them aren't necessarily math questions at all. The numbers, when you get into finance, just sort of make sense to be part of the context. So again, just from a relaxed sort of standpoint. All right, so I think that's pretty much 15. And again, there's a few like 15, 16 sort of questions, but moving from finance principles into finance practice to chapter 16, there were a lot of different loan types in there. You know, we talked about an ARM, adjustable rate mortgage. If I described an ARM and then asked you what is it, could you tell an ARM, say from a balloon? Or if I described a balloon, could you describe it, could you pick it out from an ARM? So an ARM's going to have things like caps. An ARM's going to adjust at some point in time. You know, where a balloon is going to be like a 530, right? You got a 5-year balloon, and then the entire thing is due at the end of year 5, even if it's amortized over 30 years. Completely different than an ARM. And the descriptions can be fairly concise, so you should be able to sort of pick one out from the other. So again, any of the notes that I'm giving you now, if you're not 100% sure, you can ask me now, or you can come back and ask those things on Tuesday night next week to make sure that, okay, I'm still not sure about this or that, so you've got a few more days to think about it. And lots of other kinds of terms in there. Go ahead, Braden.
What about principal and interest and arrears?
All right, so yeah, so anytime we calculate interest, you're always paying interest in arrears. So you buy a house and close on August 15th. The first payment will probably be due October 1st. At the closing, you'll pay 2 weeks worth of interest. It'll be one of your costs because the lender's going to be calculating interest always kind of 1 month in arrears. So, you know, when your October 1st payment is due, you'll be paying the interest that was accrued during September. That's how that kind of thing works, right? So anytime you calculate interest, it's always in arrears.
Okay.
Right?
And there's also like a prepayment penalty as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you anything about a prepayment penalty on a mathematics standpoint, but right, a prepayment penalty you should also remember is prepaid interest. It's tax deductible, but it's paid it's paid early in terms of before the end of the term of the loan, but it's not like a discount points or loan origination fees that are paid at the loan closing. Right, the prepayment penalty is paid when you pay the loan off earlier than the original bargain allowed for. And so prepayment penalties today aren't all that common for residential loans because so many of them are that's kind of carved out and prohibited by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or whatever loan programs. But again, in the world that I live in, or on sort of atypical on atypical residential loans, you might still see a prepayment penalty of some kind. So yeah, you should know what it is in that regard. And it's possible at the state exam you'd have to calculate one. That was one example I gave in the class, that it is possible. One of the math questions that I'll give you on Tuesday night for chapter 16 is that same interest rate calculation we went through extensively on the board, and it's in the chapter 16 PowerPoint slides, where you're given a loan amount and you're given an interest rate and you're given a payment amount, and you're asked to either say how much principal or how much interest or what the ending loan balance was after the first month's payment. That question could get extended at the state exam into a what's the prepayment penalty on the loan. So you'd have to not only calculate the ending loan balance, but apply a prepayment penalty to it. That's possible at the state exam, but I won't take it quite that far. I'll stop one step shy of that and ask you principal, interest, or ending loan balance. And again, we'll go over that again on Tuesday night.
I have a quick question.
Yes?
All right. If you have a payment due October 1st,
Yes.
okay, the interest is owed for what month?
September.
Oh, for September.
Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking it was August.
Yeah, well, that's why I say, so it's very common, it even happens when you buy a car, right? We don't do everything on the 30th of the month, and so many things are due on the 1st or whatever. So usually there's some additional period of time, and that's prepaid interest that will show up on a closing statement. I don't know what, with a car, they just give you a random date, so you start making your payments 30 days after you buy the car. But with a house, if you close on the 31st, your payment's likely to be on the 1st, and you probably won't have anything more than like 1 day of prepaid interest. But the example that I think I remember from the text is closing's June 15th, loan starts August 1st, and so you've got June 15th to June 30th interest that's paid at the closing, and then the July interest is all paid in the August 1st payment, and the August interest is paid in the September 1st payment. So when you go to close on the sale of your house that you're selling, remember that even if you're current on your house payment, you're not current on your interest, because you'll pay whatever the interest is due up from the 1st of the month up through the date of closing, and usually that the seller's lender will also expect that to be a couple weeks beyond, because they're not going to get the payment on the day you close. It'll take 2 or 3 days to convey it, for them to process it, and they want more money, and then at the end they'll mail you back a check for the $100 or few $100 that they got paid in overage. So that's that principal, that interest calculated in arrears kind of applying to when you go to sell. Because if you're trying to use every single dollar out of that sale to buy your next place, you might be a few hundred or even a few thousand short if you forget about the interest that has to be paid as part of your final payoff.
Do we need to memorize the loan limits for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
No, loan limits for Fannie and Freddie, no memorization for me, I don't think at the state exam. It's a good thing to understand that they are, that they exist, and to be able to find them fairly easily online. And particularly if you're mobile at all and thinking about investing in other areas, we are not high loan limits here. But if I went to California, for example, and bought a place out there, loan limits are totally different because it's so much more expensive. So it's a high loan limit area, or Hawaii, for example, is a high loan limit area. But you can find that pretty quickly online. So I just don't, in practice, I don't see any reason or need to memorize loan limits. Know that they exist and that they're real, but to memorize them for this course, I don't think matters. That's my personal opinion. Could you see that at the state exam? God, I hope not. I would vote against a question like that if I were on the panel looking at it. Let's see. Oh, other terms, not just loan types in terms of balloon versus ARM versus fixed, but terms like conventional, FHA, and VA. So conventional loans are, kind of, all private market forces, so that's where the PMI, private mortgage insurance, could apply. FHA and VA, their own loan programs. Some of the basics, the most important things that jump out at me with FHA and VA, for example, are, that FHA is a government insurance program funded by the borrowers. Bless you. And the VA is an entitlement program for those who have served an adequate amount, and neither of those allows prepayment penalties. And VA loans can be assigned, which is unusual today. Most loans aren't assignable. Go
Are
ahead.
FHAs easier to get if your credit rating isn't quite?
Yes. So FHA loans are usually at a slightly higher interest rate, maybe a quarter of a point, a quarter percent or something like that. The income ratio is a little bit higher. Remember we talked very briefly in chapter 3 about it's kind of 28 and 36 for the income and the debt side. On FHA they're 29 and 41, I think. So it's, you can have more debt, you can have worse credit, you can have less cash. Everything about an FHA loan is designed to make it easier to buy a house. So if you're not really big on memorization of some of these real fine point details, if you can apply that kind of thinking to an FHA loan question, I think it greatly improves your odds when you have to guess at what the answer is, right? Because you don't, FHA does not do zero money down, but it does do, what is it now, 3.5% or whatever. And the seller can pay your closing costs. So that, you know, that's about as little amount of cash today as you're going to be able to use to buy a house, unless you're doing a land contract with somebody. And yeah, lower credit scores. And that's one of the reasons why the lenders then maybe charge a little higher rate. They are taking a risk. The other thing about FHA loans is that FHA lenders approved by the FHA who make all the underwriting decisions, et cetera, are required to forbear and to wait and work with borrowers. Literally, you might have to accept somebody being delinquent for over a year under an FHA loan and give them all kinds of opportunities to work it out before you can foreclose, or the FHA will not pay off on the debt. So, you know, there is that whole thing. Go ahead.
They don't have a prepayment penalty, right?
Right, FHA or VA, neither one of those can have prepayment penalties, right? And another kind of question you could get on both FHA and VA loans, again, for the typical residential loan program, neither the FHA nor the VA is the lender. They're just the insuring or the guaranteeing body. They're there to make the lender whole in the case of a default, in whole for the FHA loans or in part for the VA loans. Right? It's the bank who gets approved by the FHA or the VA makes the loan within the constraints of the FHA and VA programs. Lots of FHA lenders, not so many VA lenders, although I think VA loans are probably more popular today, I think, just because we have more returning vets. I've never done a deal with a VA loan. Every time we've ever had a client threaten to use one, somebody was always able to find them a better deal in conventional lending. Now that's a little harder today because you don't have zero down options, but up through 2006, a lot of people bought houses with no money down, so the VA deal didn't help. And remember, both FHA has upfront MIP costs, so that mortgage insurance premium that the borrower is paying, they got to come up with that cash, or they have to borrow it in the loan, which means that's more expensive also. And the VA, the same thing. There's a funding fee. It's a lump sum, but that's a couple of points, 2.25%, 2.5%. That's got to get paid up front or get rolled into the loan. So there's a cost to those loans besides a nominally higher interest rate that you don't have with conventional loans necessarily. So again, there's options there that if the VA or FHA borrower could go conventional, it might be smarter. And a lot of people who borrow FHA or VA the first time will go to conventional the second time. Once their credit's established, rebuild, they've got some equity to work with. They're really there to make it easier. All right, other things in chapter 16 that come up, there's some legislation that's in there. I think truth in lending is mentioned there. So within the truth in lending and regulation Z, some real basic things like the 3-day right of rescission and the APR and the truth in lending disclosure, which I think is also mentioned in chapter 23. And for purposes, although they're not really identical, I think for purposes of this course, your exam, the state exam, and even just general conversation and practice, you can assume that regulation Z and the truth in lending are identical, but they're basically the same thing. Great, go ahead.
Anything about advertising?
Not from me, but at the state exam, understanding that certain words in advertising trigger the need to disclose the APR, yes, that's an important thing to know.
No ham or hard questions.
No hamper harp questions for me because I don't know how much those are or have been phased out. And I don't know that you see those kinds of things at the state exam because those things that are kind of designed to be temporary and usually don't make their way into the state exam. Or if they are, I don't know that they stay. I mean, yeah, so no, I wouldn't, for me, I wouldn't bother to study hamper harp. And I've helped some clients and friends through those kinds of things, and honestly, I don't even know which program it was. I just looked at the documents that were in front of us and helped them negotiate their way through it, referred them to an attorney or to talk to their lender about certain issues, and that was all the more I got involved, so. I was gonna say, before, not only loan types like, amortization loan, but also there's that other, later in chapter 16, after the financing, after the numbers part of it, where there's questions about things like a wraparound or a package loan, or, the purchase money mortgage. So I would look at those individual highlighted or bolded areas, and particularly make sure you focus on things like what's a purchase money mortgage, what's a package loan, what's a blanket loan. Purchase money mortgage? I think, yeah, right after we get done talking about arms and balloons, right, in that chapter, there's like a bunch of things that we went over after that that all have short paragraphs. I won't ask you a wraparound question, because those are really not very common. I don't care about growing equity mortgages. Those are not at all common today. A buy down is a possibility, because those do happen. Builders are using those. Buy down is just the use of discount points in a real quick, heavy way up front, so that you just reduce the first and second year interest rate, and then by the third year, you've got a fixed rate loan for the rest of the 30 years. Same basic principle as discount points. It's just instead of applying, getting an eighth or a quarter reduction across the loan, you get a full percent or 0.5% reduced for a year or 18 months or 2 years. At the very beginning of the chapter, kind of jumped across, at the very beginning of the chapter, it talks about the Federal Reserve System, and we talked about that for a little bit. So you should just at least know what the Fed is, right? The Fed regulates basically the country's money supply. You should hear this on the news or be reading about it. It's kind of, they meet 10 times a year, and every time one of the set of their notes comes out, or they talk about the economy or whatever, people go, are they going to raise interest rates? That's all about the Fed. What's the Fed Board of Governors doing? What are their policies? When are they going to raise rates? When the investors believe that the Fed's going to start raising rates, so that the investor-driven rates, like mortgage rates, will go up. So far, mortgage rates have continued to fall a little bit, so it's been kind of interesting. As we get closer, I'm not sure anybody really believes. It's been like 6 years or 7 years since we've had an interest rate increase in this country. That's a long time. And kind of chapter 15, kind of 16, kind of 23, understanding the basics of an impound or escrow or reserve account. That's pretty fundamental too. Not all loans have them, but we talked about it and it's in the text, right? Where the lender requires you to pay your taxes with your payment monthly, or your homeowner's insurance monthly, and then they take care of paying them as part of their servicing. For those of you who have had the fun of having a mortgage, you've lived it, and you probably get it right away because you're doing it. For those of you who haven't, that's kind of a normal thing. Lenders feel more comfortable, not all, but most lenders seem to feel more comfortable taking the responsibility for using your money to pay your taxes rather than waiting for you to do it, because of the whole lien priority thing, right? They don't want to lose their first mortgage position because you don't pay your taxes. And of course, they need to make sure your insurance is up to date because it's more their collateral than it is your home. Right? They have more at risk than we do. I'm waiting to see what the new insurance rate's going to be on the office building here in Aurora, because I think I told you all about the hail damage, right? The total hail damage is $180,000 on the property. They wrote us a check for 70-some, and when we do the work, they'll pay us the remaining 30. And it's getting pretty close to renewal time. And all I know so far is the insurance company has said, yes, we will renew, with a couple of provisos, and one of which is that the hail deductible is now $5,000 instead of $1,000, whatever. But I haven't seen the rate yet, so I'm kind of curious. The insurance companies they're interesting to deal with.
The book kind of confused me with the impound and the escrow.
Yeah.
Could you explain that a little better?
Well, they're all the same, right? A reserve account, an escrow account, an impound account are all the exact same
So
thing.
it's all the same, it's
Just different terminology, just wording, yeah. I think around here, I think people can call it an escrow account. And remember, the body of this textbook is used across the country. What they do is they take out things that don't apply, and then they add the in Illinois section, and they have an Illinois targeted textbook. So some places where they use, like up here we say puffing, downstate Illinois, they say puffery. Other parts of the country, who knows what other terms they might use for it. So I think that's all that is. It's just different terminology for the same
So it's all
thing.
it is, because it really is the
Yep,
same.
I see no difference. If there's a difference, it's lost on me.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I was afraid you were asking me something complicated.
No, I looked at it, I'm like, well, I must be missing something.
Yeah, no, I think it's just synonyms. I think that's all it is, yeah. Some things, terminology-wise, are really funky. So maybe one of the worst places for terminology is something like that installment sales contract, or land contract, or installment agreement for deed, or installment agreement for warranty deed. There's like a half a dozen different things, and the worst one for me is that in some places in the country, they just call it a real estate contract. And I'm like, no, you can't. That's like a generic term that you can't use, right? I mean, so I don't know how people keep track of that stuff in different places, but terminology does change. So again, anybody who's mobile, who invests somewhere else, who goes somewhere else, remember that a lot of what you're learning in this class becomes dangerous to you because you think you know something where it won't apply in a different state or in a different place. And I have never owned property outside Illinois. I've rented, I've lived, I've built stuff, but all of my real estate experience is pretty much limited to Illinois. So. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for finance. Winding our way down to the end here. So when we get to chapter 17, leases, and 18, property management, there can be a little bit of overlap there as well. But most of the questions here are going to come from chapter 17. Also remember that 17, everything in chapter 17 in leases is contract law. So you can get chapter 11 subjects applied to chapter 17 context, right? And the lease has to have, it for a legal purpose. It has to have consideration, right? All that kind of stuff. Everything is the same. And this is a great opportune time to really see where people are by mixing and matching ideas. Also, you can take fair housing and apply it in a property management or leasing scenario, right? It doesn't have to be a purchase scenario. And that's extremely common at the state exam, to have questions that will test on more than 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 different concepts in the same multiple choice question. I love those kinds of questions. Not to hand off to you now, but as kind of an academic and theorist looking at it going, ooh, I really get that whole thing at this stage in my career. It's kind of interesting to see how much stuff can be buried in about 4 sentences. So, I mean, that's the point you're trying to get to, is to be able to take many of these concepts now and fuse them together and kind of understand how it all works. All right, so within chapter 17, besides just basic contract law stuff, the estates that come up at the beginning, the bundle of rights and the notice issues. So things like tenancy for years, or an estate for period to period, those kinds of things, and what kind of notice, so-and-so's got this following kind of lease and they want to leave, what kind of notice do they have to give? Again, at this point in time in my course, I'm interested if you can focus on the big things, like the month-to-month, which is the typical periodic tenancy. I'm not going to ask you something about a 6-month deal where it's a little bit complicated. I don't know what you get at the state exam in that regard, but particularly, remember that when you're talking about an estate for years, it's really not for years, it's just any period of time. No notice is required because it's memorialized in the original agreement. And for a periodic tenancy, at least for a 30-day, the notice matches the period. Go ahead, Braden.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, if you're leasing a location for like 2 days, it's still being classified as a tenancy for years?
Yeah, so long as the agreement specifically states clearly when that thing ends. So you rent a hall for a wedding reception and you rent it for a half a day, that's an estate for years. It's very clear when it begins and when it ends. You don't have to go up to them and say, okay, it's midnight, we're gone now. The understanding is you've got to be out of there by midnight. So it's the same kind of thing for any kind of arrangement that you're talking about like that. Yeah. Estate for years is a complete misnomer. All you want to think about is, oh, that's a fixed, everybody knows it and has already agreed to it time frame, and therefore we know when the tenancy ends, the tenant does not have to give notice to the landlord does not have to give notice to the tenant. And if the tenant stays, you've now got a holdover. And if you have a holdover, is it an estate at will because the landlord's okay with it, or is it an estate at sufferance because the landlord isn't okay with it? Those are all things you should understand. And I think it's important for everybody to know, just for living in this state, that unless the lease says otherwise, the landlord's entitled to double rent under a holdover. Go ahead.
Do we need to know all the synonyms? The like estate for years is also called.
Yeah, right. So, right, estate for years, tenancy for years. Well, in periodic tenancy is worse, I think, because you get periodic tenancy, tenancy from period to period. I think the answer is, yeah, you should be able to interpolate those because they all mean the same thing. So it's like Kate's question about, the impound reserve or escrow account. This is what happens particularly at the state exam, where your test questions could have been written by any one of hundreds of test question writers across the country. And if they speak a certain language, they're going to write the test question in that language. And if you can't interpolate from what you learned out of this book or the language that I used, then you might miss a question where you actually know the material. Right, so that is a challenge going forward. I'm not going to introduce new language on the final exam. I've tried to teach you, and I'm trying to teach you, and we'll do so again with the math review, the specific language that you're going to see so that you understand that terminology. Hence this comprehensive review, so I can look at this and go, oh, I never said title insurance commitment before tonight. Because otherwise it's too simple to say, oh, you know enough about this, but wait, did I actually talk about a commitment? So here, when you come to those terms, I would just say generally, the more you can know about synonyms, the better off you are. Not necessarily for here, but in even something like that where it's in the book, and I've said it all 4 ways, yeah, maybe, because if I have a question on that, I don't even remember how I worded it. I hate to do that to you, but that's just the nature of English and what we've got here. Other things from chapter 17 that I would focus on for this exam. Different sort of lease concepts that they brought up, like net lease and gross lease. Also for the state exam, you get a scenario, here's the situation, the tenant is paying some of the landlord's operating costs, what do you have? Well, just that by itself should be enough to say, oh, that's some kind of a net lease. Because the landlord's operating costs are going to be taxes or cleanup or snow removal or whatever. Whereas in a gross lease, it's like an apartment. You might pay utilities, but you only write one check and you call it rent when you make a payment to the landlord. That's what a gross lease is like in an office building also. It may or may not include utilities, but you don't also pay property taxes or snow plowing. It's all covered. If there's a lot of snow, it's the landlord's problem, whereas in a net lease, if there's a lot of snow, it's the tenant's problem. Ground leases, sale and lease back, those kinds of things were mentioned in the book. Those are probably good things to make sure you're familiar with. Index and graduated leases. You may or may not get questions on these, but these terms definitely show up. And then, I'm not going to give you a math question on this, but at least understanding what a percentage lease is. They're very infrequent, so I don't think you should even get a math question on a percentage lease at the state exam, but I think there's a misconception amongst most real estate educators who mostly have a residential real estate background. The percentage leases, because it's in this book, are fairly common. I think, A, they're not that common, and when they are common, the percentage provisions oftentimes don't get triggered because the numbers are so high that the store never meets the sales, or the restaurant never sells that many sandwiches, or whatever it has to happen. That's my limited experience in that area. So it's an important thing to know what it is, but I wouldn't worry too much about the math on a percentage lease. Let's see. The eviction process. What happens there, and when we're talking about eviction, the difference between actual eviction, which is the physical removal of somebody, And then the term constructive eviction, where the tenant has the right to declare that they've been effectively evicted and move out, and it's the landlord's problem to clean up the pieces. So constructive eviction could be that case where your office is in the basement of an office building and it's constantly inundated with water and it's moldy and you can't work, and you give the landlord one last chance to clean it up and they don't, and you say, we're gone, and you walk without any liability if you're right. Constructive eviction can also be used by a residential tenant because of a violation of the implied warranty of habitability, where there's no heat, or it's inadequate, or there's rodents, or something like that, where the tenant gives the landlord the chance to fix it, the landlord doesn't, and the tenant can just say, that's it, the lease is ended. It's a good thing to know about, since most of us rent at some point in time or another, and I have been involved in some constructive eviction, or at least attempted constructive eviction cases. So I think that's pretty much 17.
So what's construction eviction?
Constructive,
Constructive?
just like, constructive eviction.
And what was the other one?
Actual eviction. So when you get thrown out of your apartment for not paying rent, that's actual eviction, where they physically remove you. Go ahead, Craig.
Sale and leaseback arrangement?
Yeah, I just know enough about it to identify it. Nothing specific, nothing detailed. I will not ask you to do anything very complicated with that. It's been in the news, I mean, not so much right away or recently, but a lot of banks and other major entities did a lot of sale and leasebacks in 07, 08, 09 to raise capital. So it is something that could come up if you have another financial meltdown, or anytime you have a company that's just trying to get out of real estate but doesn't want to move. A sale and a leaseback is a pretty good thing. Sears is doing that right now, perfect example. Sears is taking 200 of its stores, created a joint venture, they're gonna create a REIT. Remember, we talked about REITs, you won't get tested on REITs. But they're creating a REIT in conjunction with General Growth Properties, who's based in downtown Chicago and owns like Oakbrook Mall, et cetera. And then Sears will lease back those stores. So they're not gonna move, but it's a way for Sears to raise a couple $2 billion in cash and not move, and still retain some of an interest in the real estate by being one of the owners of this REIT. So that sale and leaseback stuff happens. It's still, goes on today, and worth knowing something about. All right, there's just a handful of questions from chapter 18. Simple things that I really want people to know from this chapter that either may or may not even be on the final are just things like, as a property manager, who do you work for? Right? Who's your client? It's the owner, right? I mean, you don't work for the tenant. You work for the owner. And all of your duties as a property manager run to them. If you're also doing the leasing, in leasing you can have dual agency, just like you do in buying and selling, right? You can represent the tenant, you can represent the landlord, you can represent them both. Disclosure rules are the same as we went over in chapter 4. But in property management, when you're not doing the leasing, so we're not talking about apartments, all of your duties run to the owner, period. So why do you treat the tenants well? Good customer service, because they're the customers of the building. Go ahead.
And the leases between the owner and the tenant?
Correct. Just like you're not, as an agent, you're not party to the sales contract, you're not party to the lease. How does a property manager get paid? The book lists several different options. We talked about this briefly. You could get paid on a percentage, could get paid by the hour, could get paid by the size of the staff. Remember the Sears video, for those of you who are here to watch that, where they talked about 13 building engineers and full-time general manager and security people and all that. The fee to manage that building has got to be totally different than something based on a percentage of $88 million in revenue. Probably based upon how many people are there and a multiplier on that, just like consultants or lawyers' bills. It's got to be something much more like that. We're going to charge you $30 an hour for every building engineer, and $80 an hour for the property manager, and $65 an hour for the security manager, or whatever. Probably something much more like that. So there's any number of ways in which you can get paid. Flat fees are also possible. Flat fees are really common with houses. You get paid like $100 a month or $150 a month to manage the house if you're not doing any leasing, something like that, because all you do is show up and meet the contractors or take the calls or collect the rent.
It's not a lot of work. So you can, again, flat fees, percentages, hourly, again, just be familiar with the different ways in which a property manager can get paid. There's a list of maintenance types in that chapter. So I will give you a scenario and ask you to tell me, what is it? Is it, construction maintenance, which would be like building out a space or adding addition? Is it corrective maintenance? Is it preventive maintenance or preventative maintenance? So you should look at those. Just one example. It should be pretty straightforward. And some other things that are good to know about property management that I don't really see that I have any specific questions here on are other things like that whole risk assessment thing that's at the end of the chapter. Again, this is not on your final, but for the state exam, I think it's a pretty good idea to be able to identify between sort of controlling the risk, avoiding the risk, that kind of thing, transferring the risk. And then the property management agreement, just some of those things that are included, like statement of the owner's purpose, and maybe the single most important thing, the fact that your whole job is about making money for your client, right? It's about maximizing the value or maximizing the income or both. So if you think along those lines, if you get qualitative questions at the state exam, remember you work for the owner, the whole job is to maximize cash flow or maximize value. If they're looking to sell eventually, that's the property manager's job. It can help you answer some other kinds of questions. And you can also get some math questions, and so we'll have one math question that we'll look at on Tuesday, and it has to do with vacancy and occupancy rates. So we touched on this idea lightly. So vacancy and occupancy rates are opposites. Just like loan to value is the opposite of down payment or is the opposite of equity, right? 80% LTV means 20% equity. Well, 80% occupancy means 20% vacancy. 100% occupancy means no vacancy. So a common sort of thing you may have to calculate here is, I'll give you a 100-unit apartment building that has got 4 units empty. Across, for whatever reason, 4 units are empty. What's the occupancy rate? It should be 96%. Right? Just looking at it, going, okay, 96 out of the 100 units are occupied. It's a 96% occupancy rate, which means a 4% vacancy rate. So we're going to go over that with you on Tuesday, excuse me. But there will be one math question that relates to that. So again, just the idea of occupancy versus vacancy, how many people are in the building. For me, when you're talking something about other than apartments that I'm used to, it's about percentage of square feet in the building leased, but I won't do that to you. Apartments are easier for you to imagine, so it'll be something related to that. And it won't be based on 100 units, that's too easy. But you get the premise, the idea. Okay, so that's chapter 18. 19 is all about appraisal. Appraisal is also a good place for math. So there is one math question, again, that we'll go over in detail. But that math question, as I'm looking at it, also comes back to one specific principle that we talked about briefly that I don't think is that well, if at all, illustrated in the book. Remember, when lenders lend, they lend based upon the lower of the sale contract or the appraised value. So when you have a conflict, you sell the house at $100,000 and the appraisal comes in at $90,000, and the lender said they were going to make, an 80% loan to value. They're not going to loan 80% of 100 now. They're only going to loan 80% of 90,000. Because this kind of thing is happening more frequently now than it used to, it's an important concept for you to understand. So again, we'll go over the math itself on Tuesday, but the idea is, you're going to you'll be given a sale amount and an appraisal amount. One's going to be obviously higher than the other, and you'll be given an LTV percentage, and you're going to have to identify how much of a loan is the lender actually going to make. So if the appraisal amount is higher than the sales contract, don't be fooled by that. Use the sales contract. If the appraisal amount is lower than the sales contract, forget the sales contract, you got to go with the appraisal. Whichever of the two numbers is lower, that's the number you will apply the loan to value. I'm just giving you a few days to think about that, and then we'll specifically go over the math on Tuesday. Because what happens, particularly, if the appraisal is higher, it doesn't really matter. The borrower is not going to be able to get any more money because the lender's going to loan based upon the sale price. It's like bragging rights. Woo-hoo, I got a good deal. It's meaningless, really meaningless today. And if you've got appraisal that's too low, now you have a problem that has to be solved, because now there's not enough money to do the deal, and who's gonna yield? Buyer coming up with more cash, seller gonna take a lower price, gonna go out and hire another appraiser, yell at the one you have. Somehow you've gotta figure out how to bridge that gap, or the deal falls apart. So that's something to be worth knowing. Again, we'll go over the math specifically on Tuesday. All right, so back to the principles in the chapter. We've got 3 different appraisal methods that are important to follow in terms of the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. So which is used for what? That's an important basic. Sales comparison or market approach for single-family housing. That's really where it shines. That's where you're gonna see that. You can also see that used as one of 3 methods on an income property. But if you're talking about existing housing stock, sales comparison approach is what you're gonna use. Cost approach, unique properties, complicated properties, as a backup to an income approach on a building like my investment property. And you can even do it as a backup on a house, though it's not that common today. So, there's a big difference today. My office building, I don't know what's it worth, $5.5 million. I bet the replacement cost is closer to $7 million. People will probably buy it based upon the income stream, not based upon the cost to replace it. But I always see that cost to replace it, the asset's worth a lot more money than what the income justifies. So, you want to understand with the cost approach what it gets applied to, and then also some of the steps. Remember, in cost approach, we had depreciation. It only shows up in cost approach, right? And depreciation is defined as any reduction in value. And then the book talks about those 3 different types. So you could get a question where you have to figure out, well, which type of depreciation is it? Functional obsolescence, which was normal wear and tear. Externalities, which is anything outside of the property owner's control, like it's in the flight path of O'Hare, it's sitting on Route 47 or Randall Road, it's next to a garbage dump, you can't move it, it's an external problem. Or functional obsolescence. The galley kitchen, the 5-bedroom, 1-bath house, the 1-car garage, the house on a slab, whatever it is that, it's got features in it that nobody wants anymore. Because remember, in the cost approach, first we say, what would it be worth if it were brand new today? And then we got to ding it in value for what people don't like about it. And then the income approach, just again, what's the income approach all about? It's all about the value of that rental income. And it's all about net leased property at that point in time. You can apply the income approach, like particularly a gross rent multiplier, to houses, duplexes, 4 flats, but really we get into the direct capitalization approach where we're talking about apartments, offices, retail, net leased industrial, that kind of thing. Real hardcore investment property. Anything about kind of what the appraiser is doing, what you're doing as a part of the market analysis, particularly as it relates to that sales comparison approach. So adjustments. Remember, we never adjust the subject, we only adjust the comps. The comp is poor, you add to its value. The comp is better, you subtract from its value. So you can get a question that says, the subject has an extra bathroom. What do you do? Then the bathroom is worth $5,000. How do you handle that? Well, if the subject is better, so that means that the comp is poorer, then you got to add money to it, because if you knew that the comparable sold for $100,000, what would it have sold for if it had an extra bathroom? So the question you're really asking, so you have to add money to it, and you would add the $5,000. So now we talk about adding or subtracting, but it's also adjusting upward or adjusting downward. It's also similar, synonymous language you can see on a test question. Within the income approach, particularly the direct capitalization approach, and of understanding what the cap rate is, it's that sort of rate of return on investment that an owner would expect, and having a basic idea of what NOI represents, so the net operating income. It's an income after you subtract the building's ability to generate cash, right? After you subtract all the operating expenses, etc. And basic things like, what the heck is market value? And that's what you're doing, right? You're coming up with a market value, whether it's your CMA or the appraiser. So I think that's what I have from appraisal. At the state exam, you could get an IRF question. So, you can get a math question at the state exam that asks you to apply a cap rate to a particular income stream to come up with market value, or any combination of those three. So I would suggest, if you can handle it, you memorize that and understand that IRF process when you go to the state exam. If you can't, if you're only gonna get one question on it, don't, jump off the bridge, but, it's worth being able to do. Chapter 20, there's not a whole lot, a couple of questions. There's really not a whole lot of testable stuff there. So, a couple things overlap with chapter 7 there. Building permits, zoning permits, that's police powers. So that's kind of chapter 7 kind of here. And then there are more details about zoning. So you'll need to be able to kind of define or understand differences between special use permits and variances. I'm not going to ask you anything process oriented, like going to the zoning board of appeals or that kind of thing necessarily, but you want to understand those. And non-conforming use, that's the other one of that sort of trifecta. It was legal, now the zoning has changed. It wouldn't be legal, except we're going to continue to allow it so long as you don't change it, right? And that's another important thing common thing to have to apply with non-conforming use. So long as you don't touch it, as long as you leave it the way it is, in most cases, you don't have to do anything with a non-conforming use. But as soon as you want to renovate it, improve it, change it, bring it up to modern technology, you may have to throw out that use entirely because it doesn't meet the zoning requirements. Within zoning, it's good to understand just what zoning even regulates, right? I mean, zoning regulates a lot of stuff. Not only is it property use type, here be retail, here be industrial, but also the size and shape and building material types and how close to the street. All that stuff is regulated by zoning, and with residential subdivisions in particular, the density, right? Zoning decides how big the lot sizes have to be. And I think that's probably chapter 20. Four questions that relate directly to fair housing. Again, keep in mind that particularly at the state exam, I can't sometimes figure out if a question is meant to be fair housing or property management or leasing or sales or professional duties like under ethics or whatever. So, I mean, there in particular, even though they tell you you're going to get like 3 fair housing questions, you go to the state exam, you might get 5 because some of them might show up under a different category. It's an important area. It's a very important area. It's still a big problem, unfortunately, as you can figure out. All right, so the Federal Fair Housing Act is the main thing to focus on for here and the state exam. That seems to be what most of the questions will revolve around. So who enforces it? That's HUD. What's the statute of limitations and filing a complaint? You should remember for next week, that's just a year. It's fairly short as far as statute of limitations go. So we have those protected classes. You should be generally familiar with those. And then the exemptions under the Federal Fair Housing Act and its amendments. What are the main exemptions? Like for seniors housing or for somebody who scares you, because you feel threatened by them. Whatever one of the ones that they mainly emphasize. Those are absolute, real fundamental fair housing related questions. The whole range of no-no words, blockbusting, steering, redlining. not only enough to know that they're all bad things, but which is which, right? So redlining is typically lending or appraising. Steering is typically dealing with buyers that could also be tenants. And blockbusting is typically dealing with sellers.
Can you repeat that?
No, it's no problem. I'll go backwards, actually. Blockbusting is typically dealing with sellers, convincing them to sell because there's too many young Hispanic women in the neighborhood. We better get out. Steering is, welcome to our neighborhood. You can live over there in that corner. Or welcome to Aurora. You get to live on the east side. Or welcome to the apartment complex. You live in the building by the dumpsters. That's steering, where you limit somebody's choices when they're a prospective tenant or buyer. And then redlining is that to draw a big picture in your mind of literally a red line drawn around the neighborhood saying, we're lenders, we know what the hell we're doing, and we are not loaning money in this area because there are too many whatevers in that specific area. It was originally targeted at African Americans, but the same thing could be true today of Arab Muslims or whatever other group some lender wants to get their shorts in a knot about. And although they don't really happen much anymore, First Am Bank, which has a pretty good reputation around here, signed a consent agreement with HUD about 10 years ago, not admitting to any wrongdoing, but for redlining, because HUD looked at First Am Bank's lending statistics and said, how come all your banks are all located in white neighborhoods and all your clients are all white borrowers? Oops. So First Am Bank agreed that the next 5 branches they opened would all be in Latino or black neighborhoods.
Would redlining be in connection with like an antitrust violation, by any chance?
Well, redlining is literally just the idea of drawing a line around there, so I don't think so, but if you give me a specific example, I'm not an antitrust law expert, I don't have a lot of case law stuff there in my head, so.
I just kind of pictured someone grouping a section of people off.
Oh, yeah, well, right, but I don't think that would be an antitrust issue. It would be more of we're not gonna do business with you at all.
Okay.
I suppose, let me just say this about law in general. Laws oftentimes are not applied the way they were originally intended. The RICO statutes are a perfect example of that. They were meant to stamp out organized crime. They're hardly ever used for organized crime. They're more frequently used today in private litigation, and they're horrifically damaging because you can get triple damages. So, it could be a case like something like that, where somebody has maybe a weak case with fair housing, for example, and a sharp attorney goes, well, why don't we also sue them for antitrust? I'd have to think about that more to see if that would apply, but in general, in my head, they're completely separate issues. All right, I think that's, and then there'll be something you ought to know, at least basics about the Illinois Human Rights Act. So the real basics of the Human Rights Act, just at least know, that there's more, there's a lot more protected classes, almost twice as many by number of classes, 6 more than the 7 under the Fair Housing Act. And, since you're gonna know that HUD deals with the Fair Housing Act, you ought to know that the Illinois Department of Human Rights is where somebody would go to file a complaint under the Illinois Human Rights Act. And you should never forget that you're elderly once you turn 40. Since I'm a little bit beyond that, I want everybody else in the room who maybe is just approaching it to also feel bad about it. Okay. Chapter 22, also just a few questions there. I would focus on radon and lead. Those are the 2 biggest things. You're going to go to the state exam, they could ask you any environmental mess question they want, but for here, just focus on the area of lead, the lead disclosure, radon, the radon disclosure. Specifically with radon, we're talking about the Illinois Radon Awareness Act, right? Because that's just where it applies, it's here. So if you spend your chapter 22 time on those 2 things, you should be good for my test. Then for chapter 23, a few of these things again may overlap or whatever. I said to you the other night I couldn't remember if I had a math question from that chapter anymore. I do not. So there's not a proration question. However, you might still get a question of like debit to whom and credit to whom. So you need to understand who pays for what. That's important to me because that's some of the first things you'll start doing as an agent is preparing net sheets for sellers, you need to understand, remember things like seller pays the transfer taxes for state and county, and some municipal transfer taxes. The seller's gotta pay their own recording costs, legal fees, inspections if they have any, that kind of thing, So again, about proration, just kind of the types of expenses, types of things that are prorated, like real estate taxes or rents in an investment property. Right, if rents are due on the first of the month and I close on that rental property any other day than the first, right, rents have to be prorated because the seller owns the building for the first part of the month, and the buyer owns it for the last part. If the seller collects all the rent, then the seller's got to give the buyer money at closing. So the types of things that get prorated, again, not a math question, but just what are some of those things? And it's all in the book. You've got a nice chart to look at. And then just off of the closing statement in general, and off of that list, they have bullet points about who pays for what. I get that it's probably redundant from what I said, but basic idea of buyer pays their costs, typically seller pays their costs. So if we're talking about who pays for what recording costs, because both parties are going to have recording costs. The seller's going to pay to release their mortgage. The borrower's going to pay to record the deed, because they want that. The borrower's going to pay to record the mortgage, because the lender's going to make them. Right, simple thing like that at this point in time, to kind of understand what the documents are, how they work, who's going to pay for what, and just ascribing it to whichever party benefits from that. And I think that's pretty much what I got. Unless, of course, I grabbed the wrong notes, in which case you're screwed. But don't worry about it. I don't want you to think about that. So if you have other questions, I'm happy to hang out and talk to you. On Tuesday night, again, at 6:30, we will start with math. 8, 9 questions, whatever it is. Some of them go fairly quickly. If you have questions or need me to repeat them, I will gladly do that. I'll just do one example of each one on the board, give you a sense of what you're looking for. Math is challenging for some of you, so what I'm trying to do in part is let you know what's coming. I'm not going to give you the numbers, but I'll give you the process, and I'll also give you a sense of what the language is going to sound like, so you'll know what to look for. I don't want you thrown by verbiage at this point. But remember, when you get to the state exam, math is a pretty wide open thing and can come from almost any corner of what we've been learning. And then after we do that, we'll also do course evaluations on Tuesday night, and it's wide open for the remainder of the time for any questions that you have. So we could be here for the full time. And when it comes to Tuesday night, if you have some questions and everybody else in the room gets up and leaves but you, please stay and ask me the questions. Don't feel like, oh, nobody else had questions, I should stay. I don't care if I'm here with one person for 2 hours. Whatever questions you have, I'm happy to ask. But if you just stare at me blankly, I will have nothing to say to you, because I'm not gonna give you the whole class all over again in a 1 hour thing. So again, you have to look at things and go, gosh, this is an area where I'm really weak, I wonder, and you're gonna have to come up with questions. So I just kind of forewarned you.
How complex is the question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't worry at all. Like the rectangular survey system, just be able to identify the main parts. If I say the following components are in a legal description, be able to tell me which one of those it is. Again, there are no diagrams, no pictures, no, Joe lived in the 24th section and he went 6 miles south, where did he end up? Nothing like that. Not from me. You could get that at the state exam. Why they care about that, I'm not too sure. There's a lot of stuff at the state exam that I and some of my fellow instructors sometimes scratch our heads over. Why are they asking these questions? But, this industry, what we do touches on a lot of different things. So depending upon who's experienced, like I say, I have used all the stuff that you're learning. At some point in time, I've used some piece of all of it. But I'm a strange bird that way. Most of you will use about half of what you learn over a full career. One last thing. So a week from tonight, when the final exam is for those of you who are taking the face-to-face class, my plan is to be down here as early as 5:30 with the tests and everything, scratch paper and stuff, and ready to go. So if you want to get in here earlier, I don't think there's a class ahead of us. You guys would know better than me, but I don't think there's anybody in here ahead of us. So that being the case, you know, you could start early if you want to. You have no obligation to come in early, but you're welcome to do so if it eases your anxiety. And if the room is available, feel free to come in and just read and study quietly. Just keep in mind that once you start, all your materials have to be put away except for a pencil, eraser, scratch paper, and a calculator. And feel free to, you know, ask me questions anytime between now and then. I think you're well prepared. So be confident, you know, relax, try and just study and focus. I know the natural thing is to get nervous, but you're not running from a hungry lion, so adrenaline is not as valuable here as it is in some other circumstances. Mostly just taking time to think. Again, practice a lot of test questions between now and next week. If you don't have anything else, I release you for the evening, and I'll see you Tuesday night.